All right, I think we're about time, so I'll make a start. So just to introduce myself, so I'm Luke Tesey. I'm an Associate Director in Deloitte based in the UK. And today I want to give an introduction to analysing geospatial data at scale using Databricks with use cases in environment and agriculture. So this work is inspired by work that our team have done in collaboration with some of our partners and clients back home. If you're not familiar with geospatial analysis, then don't worry, we'll be introducing the key concepts and etc. as we go along. But if you are, then hopefully we still have some interesting food for thought in terms of how we approach some of these problems. Okay, so just to give a brief outline, so we're going to start off with motivation and use cases. So why is geospatial analysis important when it comes to environment and agriculture? We'll then look at sort of architecture and tools, so how Databricks fits in with the rest of the sort of geospatial platforms and tools and ecosystem. And then based off that, then we'll go and have a look at specific problems and techniques around the use of vector analysis and raster analysis. So vector analysis in the context of geospatial data, that's points and polygons and lines. Raster data is more when you're looking at imagery, essentially. So why is this important? So it's no surprise, I guess, that some of the biggest challenges that we're facing today as a society are the twin problems of an increasing population and climate change and environmental protection. So just to illustrate that, so the UN currently predict that we're looking at a global population peaking this century around 10 billion people. And with that, then we need to feed ourselves. So, by the middle of the century, some predictions say that we could need to increase our food production and agricultural output by something like 50%. And this comes at a time when we're already using 1/3 of all available land mass on the planet for agriculture. And it's not that we can just go and take another third, right? So 1/3 of that is forest, the other third of that is desert and uninhabitable. So we kind of have to work within the bounds of what we've got there. And then it should be no surprise then, given the extent of that the current estimate is that something like 13 to 21% of greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to how we use the land, so agriculture, forestry, etc., to feed ourselves and provide the other resources we need. So absolutely very important area. Yeah, in terms of geospatial data, so it's really about trying to say, okay, how do we gather all of this information and really understand how we're using the land and inform policy in terms of how we address these twin challenges. So in particular, just to give you a flavor of some of the use cases that we're looking at, so when we're looking at the environment, so one example is watershed and flood risk. So trying to understand using things like LiDAR data, can we model what happens when we have increased rainfall and flooding in the future? What sort of interventions can we make in order to address that? Precision agriculture, so helping farmers by analyzing the soil and how we're using the land, and can we target, for instance, how we're using resources such as fertilizer and pesticides, etc., in a more targeted way, so that we can increase production, but with less input and less of an environmental impact from things like runoff of fertilizer, etc., off the land. Other things we're interested in is animal disease control and epidemiology. So thinking about modeling how disease, things like bovine TB spreads, and when we have an outbreak, can we look at doing analysis around where are all the farms in the area? How do we start to control that outbreak, etc. And then both within agriculture and environment, basically looking at mapping different vegetation zones and how the land is being used. So, for example, if you look at the UK or the EU, we provide a lot of area-based schemes where we're giving grants to farmers based on the total area of land that they farm for different purposes. So having accurate mapping of different land parcels, where the fields are, etc., really important for making sure that farmers are adequately and accurately given the payment that they need. And then looking at habitat. So some really interesting examples of that are things like blue carbon. So you get environments such as salt marsh and seagrass, etc., and also on land, peatland as well. So these are all environments that really they really punch above their weight in terms of the amount of carbon that they can put into the ground. So trying to restore these habitats, map and understand the different vegetation zones within them. These are really interesting challenges for policymakers, etc., trying to improve those environments. Okay, so in terms of the data that we bring to bear, so as I sort of mentioned earlier, that comes in two main forms. So we have vector data, and this is sort of lines, polygons, points, etc., that you tend to see on your average map or map application. And that's really efficient for doing lots of sort of analysis and statistics over different pieces of land, infrastructure, etc. But in terms of raw data, quite often that comes in the form of imagery. So not just, you might think of, your typical RGB images, etc., but where, each pixel is your true color, your red, green, blue, etc. But also with satellite imagery, etc., you can have multi-band, so you'll have near-infrared data, you'll have LiDAR, sort of digital elevation data. In that case, the pixel values are, representing, different values. So in the case of LiDAR, that'll be, each pixel value is actually your height above sea level or to some reference point. And with near-infrared as well, so if you combine that with sort of visible light spectrum, so you can do lots of interesting things. So you can calculate indexes that tell you something about vegetation and water for flooding and water bodies, etc. Okay, so luckily these things all come with their own open standards that are well supported across different geospatial packages, and these we can leverage within Databricks as well. So in the case of vector data, it's typically things like GeoJSON. There's also well-known text, well-known binary, which are probably not well-known outside of geospatial circles, but well-known when it comes to GIS platforms. So these basically provide a way of encoding your points, your polygons, your lines, etc., within standard data types. And then what comes with raster data, so while that can use sort of standards that are based on standard sort of image formats like TIFF, for instance, there are some differences. So as well as the image, the pixel data itself, you also have to keep in mind the metadata. So the actual mapping of where each pixel has to align to a particular geospatial location on the ground. So that metadata has to come with it. And the other interesting thing is obviously the scale. So it's not just single images, it's tiles. So you're breaking up the entire globe or region of interest into individual tiles. And quite often, particularly if you're visualizing this data, you don't want to, if you think about Google Earth, for instance, if I'm looking at the entire planet, I'm not loading every single tile of pixel data into memory so that I can view that, right? So being able to view the data and analyze the data at different scales is important. And rather than computing that on the fly, we tend to store that as an image pyramid. So basically take the same data and we store it at different resolutions so that we can access it at different scales when we need to. So that's what the data looks like. That's the sorts of problems we want to solve. So what are the tools that we can bring to bear to solve that then? So when we bring Databricks into the picture, the goal is not to replace sort of the other geospatial tools that we have in our ecosystem. The goal very much is to complement that, so bring to bear the scale and the versatility of Databricks to do large, complex analysis, right? But very much to complement the sort of mature features and functionality that we have in existing geospatial platforms. So if we kind of start on the left-hand side of the slide in terms of ingestion, so typically the kind of data sets that we're bringing that in, it might be file-based rasters from large sort of aerial surveys that we've commissioned. It might be calling APIs out to satellite imagery providers. And bringing data both from sort of geospatially enabled platforms such as ArcGIS Enterprise, but also non-spatial databases as well, so that we can bring all of this together and enrich it. And while currently we tend to do this in sort of file-based batch ingestion workloads, there are some interesting use cases we're looking at where we're doing more event-driven ingestion as well. So a nice example of that is in ArcGIS, they support versioning of map data. So, for instance, if we're making changes to official land boundaries, etc., all of that has to go through quality control and reviews before those changes get committed to the main map. So, Esri basically provide that versioning history, if you like, if all the changes have been made. So we're looking about how we can tap directly into that change history and drive like a change data capture sort of workflow in terms of bringing that data in. And that means that rather than having to reprocess absolutely everything on a regular basis, we can take those changes in and make small changes to our data products out the other side. And then in terms of how we're storing it, so I mean all of this still fits within the sort of standard medallion infrastructure. So bringing our raw data in to bronze, processing that through silver, and building data products out the far end. So all of our sort of vector data can go in there, but sometimes with the raster data, we're still storing raster files and sort of standard formats there as well. But the same principles and sort of governance, etc., still apply. And then we're pushing that back out the other end. So we're making those insights available by pushing the data back into some of these geospatial platforms, such as ArcGIS, where we've got mature visualization capabilities, and you can integrate that with desktop GIS tools as well. Yes? Yeah, so you can do both. So we do store it as, so I mentioned the well-known sort of text and GeoJSON, etc. But as you'll see, there are standard Spark libraries that provide sort of like custom geospatial data types, so you can sort of interpret that natively as well. But I think it's a growth area for Databricks as well, so they do have some built-in support for some of these things as well. Okay, so that's how we get the data in, that's how we get the data out. But the other key thing is making sure that the scientists, the decision makers, and actually the general public, can discover the outputs of this and make use of that. And it was interesting, I was attending one of the talks, I think earlier today or yesterday, where they mentioned this as well, where quite often within a large organization, you could have multiple people basically coming up with the same analysis and not being aware that some of this analysis has already been done or the data is already available. So in order to solve that, it's not specific to geospatial, but I think it's quite an important one. We've built sort of a business user-friendly data portal. And the way that works essentially is we harvest all of our sort of technical metadata for data assets both from Unity Catalog, but also from other systems within the ecosystem. We then bring all of that data along with sort of the data product descriptions, the business metadata about what the data is, who owns it, what it's for, how you access it. And we master all of that in Microsoft Purview. And then we use Databricks pipelines then to take that metadata out of Purview, populate a search index that then we can make available through data portals, both to the public, but also internally as well. And a key sort of design decision we made there was to align the sort of metadata schema that we use for that to something called DCAT. DCAT is a W3C standard, essentially, that's used by a lot of open data platforms, such as CCAN, which sits behind a lot of the sort of UK Gov data portals. So by aligning to that sort of schema, it means that we can then actually make that data harvestable and export it out into other open data platforms as well. Okay, so that's our architecture, and in terms of some of the tools we're using. So before we get to sort of large sort of Spark distributed libraries, it's worth calling out there are a lot of sort of non-Spark native libraries and tools that are very useful and kind of provide the foundation for that. So GDAL sits underneath quite a lot of geospatial software. It's basically your Swiss Army knife of all of the I/O essentially for different formats to do with vector and raster. We've then got things like Shapely and GeoPandas that are really quite mature in terms of handling this sort of data in pure Python. Raster I/O is again our sort of main go-to non-Spark library for doing analysis and I/O with raster data, etc. And then we have some other niche tools as well, things like PyShed, etc. So some other open source Python libraries that we use for analysis, such as looking at watershed and how water flows through the landscape. And then when it comes to making that distributed, bringing Spark to bear, so a couple of things we use there. So we use the built-in H3 support within Databricks, which was mentioned some of the talks earlier in the week. So this allows us to do efficient indexing using completely out of the box with Databricks. We use Mosaic, which is a Databricks Labs project that has a number of features on with vector and raster formats. A couple other ones such as Apache Sedona we're looking at as well. But a lot of these libraries play nice with the previous non-Spark libraries that we mentioned on the other page. And quite often, actually, we can achieve a lot of what we want to do just by using user-defined functions with some of those earlier libraries. All right, so if we look at vector analysis or lines and polygons, if we think about some examples of what we might want to do with that, so it might be, okay, we've got a disease outbreak, can we look at all of the farms within a certain radius of that? Can we look at different habitats and vegetation zones within a given region of interest? So again, the sorts of common operations you want to do there, it's things like aggregation or statistics or looking at maybe set functions over different polygons. So one example might say if you've got all the polygons for all of the fields within a farm, you might want to join those together to have a representation of all the different farms within a given area. So all of these things have broad support in all of the libraries that we mentioned earlier. But probably the most interesting one in terms of computational complexity is when we're trying to do spatial join. So we have a large data set of land parcels or whatever it might be on one side. We have a region of interest or something else that we need to join or intersect that with on the other side. How do we do that in an efficient way? So this is where H3 comes in, which I said is out of the box with Databricks. So H3 is an indexing system, a hierarchical one that was first developed by Uber to deal with some of the large data challenges that they had. And basically what it does is it breaks the entire globe up into these mostly hexagonal areas, and then you can basically take the cell ID for those different hexagonal areas to say, right, well, if I have a set of polygons or points or geometries within the same cell, then I can join on the cell ID. So this is sort of what it looks like. So depending on the resolution of the data that you're looking at, you can go all the way from resolution 0, which is thousands of kilometers in area, down to cells that are roughly about one square meter. So you can take it down to quite a granular level. So it's really just about picking the scale that's best suited to the data you're looking at. And then if we want to do a join, so say we have, so I've got my land parcels and I'm trying to find all the land parcels within a certain area of interest. The first step is to take my different polygons. I map that onto the whole set of H3 cells, essentially, that fully cover that polygon. And then that gives me a set of cell IDs, essentially, that are associated with that polygon. And if I do that for both sets of geometries that are of interest, then I can basically use something like liquid clustering to do the join in the normal way between the tables. And that essentially gets you close to the answer. Now, obviously, it's not perfect, so you could have two polygons that don't intersect but still intersect the same cell. So there might be a bit of refinement you need to do after that, but it gets you to where you need to be, essentially, and you can make significant gains, in terms of computational time. Okay, so in terms of raster analysis, again, wide support for a lot of the basic sort of operations you might want to do. So things like raster IO, so reading those sort of standard formats, such as GeoTIFFs, etc., bringing that into the platform, the sorts of operations we might want to do. So you might want to do algebra, essentially. So like, can we do mathematical operations over different tiles, different data sets that represent different factors? We might want to do statistics over those things as well. So taking all of the tiles that sit within a certain bounding box and calculating statistics over the top of that. And there's also more complex things we might want to do. So I mentioned watersheds earlier, etc. So trying to understand how water flows over the environment based on LiDAR data, etc. So all of this sort of stuff we can bring to bear. And just to give one example of where we can use this sorts of analysis. So this is a piece of work we did to look at mapping intertidal zones around the coast. So to do that, we were using Sentinel-2 satellite imagery alongside 1 meter resolution LiDAR digital elevation model. And what we did was we basically you can take a time series of satellite imagery over a given region of interest. You can then take that satellite imagery and calculate what we call a normalized difference water index. So that basically is a very simple calculation on I think it's the green channel and your near infrared channel, which gives you a good indication of how much water, or if there is water present at that pixel location. So we can do that for every tile in the time series. Then with Sentinel, you can also use, you basically treat like cloud cover as missing values. And if you basically then sort of average, the water index over time for a particular area, what that basically gives you is an indication of what percentage of the time is that particular location covered by water or not. So if it's out to sea, it's going to be covered by water all the time. If it's inland, you're never going to see any water there, hopefully. But if it's in that intertidal zone, it tends to change depending on if it's high tide or low tide. And then we can refine that by doing sort of tidal inundation modeling with the LiDAR data. And it gives us a rough empirical measure then of understanding where these intertidal zones are. Okay, so the other big area for raster data is if we're trying to do computer vision. So a number of different applications for that. So that could be everything from sort of object detection, where we're trying to understand and identify rural infrastructure, etc. It could be, quite often it's segmentation. So trying to look at the orthophotography and identify different vegetation zones or different areas of land use within the environment. So again, one example of that is salt marsh, where we're trying to map out the extent of the different vegetation zones in there. And the other thing that we mentioned earlier was sort of the boundary detection, so understanding where the boundaries are between fields and doing accurate mapping of farms, etc. So various different models that we can use for that. So we've done a lot of work with UNet, which is a sort of deep learning convolutional neural net, which was originally designed, I think, for medical imagery, but has reasonably success when it comes to satellite data, etc. as well. Things like YOLO, which is sort of more or less state of the art in terms of object detection and instance segmentation. So that's a good candidate as well. Particularly, it's quite efficient in terms of you're not going over the image multiple times. It's quite quick in terms of its analysis. So that's also a good candidate when we're looking at trying to scale this. Based off YOLO as well, so a recent paper that came out, I think it was last year, was delineate anything resolution agnostic field boundary delineation and satellite imagery. So that's something we haven't explored yet, but it's one we're quite interested in looking at. It shows really promising results in terms of identifying those boundaries between fields at different scales. And other things that we've looked at in the past as well is sort of weakly supervised techniques as well. So if you think, quite often, the challenge with computer vision or any machine learning is getting that ground truth, getting that training data. And it can be quite a lot of effort if you're trying to go around and annotate exactly where all the boundaries are in your different vegetation zones by hand, and then use that to train your model. So there's some work out there in terms of weak supervision, where you basically give it sort of image level or point level training data, and it can give some reasonable results in terms of training without as much effort in terms of trying to build up those labeled training data sets. And while this is sort of early work for us in terms of taking it from proof of concept to trying to scale it, so in principle, the way you would treat these sort of pipelines is very much how you would do any sort of image computer vision sort of workflows within the likes of Databricks. So we can leverage things like MLflow and mosaic streaming, etc., to build up those training and prediction pipelines. I think the key differences are, I suppose, one, how we bring the data in. So the fact that you're trying to read that raw data initially from those sort of geospatial raster formats. You're then trying to keep the metadata intact as well. So the fact that these aren't just pixel coordinates; they're actually world coordinates that we have to keep track of. And then once we get the result out the other end, it's about doing the post-processing, and we need to bring that back into a result that we can use. So, for instance, if I get an image level segmentation, which sort of represents, okay, well, here's the sort of vegetation zone classification for every pixel in my image. The way I don't want to consume that just as an image. I want to be able to sort of identify the bounding boxes of different regions of vegetation. So usually there's a bit of pre-processing or sort of post-processing that we need to do there as well. But other than that, a lot of what applies to building efficient, scalable computer vision pipelines applies to geospatial data as well. But it's not without its challenges. So key things that we have to think about here are things like seasonal and regional variation. So if I look at a forest, or if I look at salt marsh or whatever, the way the vegetation looks in December, it could be very different from how it looks in June, when maybe some of those plants are in full foliage or they're in bloom, etc. So a lot of sort of intra-class variation, I suppose, based on the time of year and the region that you're looking at. We've got sort of tile boundary effects to take into account, so you don't want your model coming up with a prediction that says one thing for one tile at the boundary, but then when you're trying to combine all of those different tiles together, you want to sort of have a consistent result. Change detection is an interesting one as well, because quite often the machine will get you so far, but there's still an element of you need to have the human in the loop here for review and quality control. So trying to sort of identify has a change occurred, what tiles, what areas do we actually have to get a human in the loop here to review that output is something that we have to look at as well. So that sort of takes to that final point around the accurate ground truthing is really important to work very closely with the experts and the scientists in these areas. So for example, again, if I go back to salt marsh, the way this is done typically is it's literally somebody goes out with their boots on into the marsh, puts down a set square and has to literally count like the number of different species or what species are present at that location. So that's really important for accuracy. So where I think the machine learning can help here is it can sort of help identify those overall boundaries quite often, but you still need to combine that with the ground truthing for many of these use cases for an accurate result. All right, so in terms of key takeaways, so essentially large-scale geospatial analysis is essential for addressing some of these sort of key problems that we face as a society today in terms of feeding ourselves without wrecking the planet in the process. Integrating Databricks with those sort of existing geospatial technologies allows us to do this sort of scalable analysis. So again, it's not about replacing our geospatial tool set, it's about complementing that when it comes to problems that require more scale and more complex analysis. And key enablers there are the sort of existing ecosystem of sort of Spark libraries and other open source tools that we have in the toolbox. I should say there are commercial offerings as well. So the likes of Esri, for instance, do provide commercial libraries that can run directly on top of Databricks, and there are other examples of that as well. And again, what we're saying there in terms of sort of computer vision, which is an interesting area of growth for us in this area. Okay, so that is me. As always, we've got the usual slide in terms of completing your survey. So hopefully that was of interest to some of you. Thank you.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, you can come up to the speaker afterward. However, I do want to mention that you will need to vacate the room in 2 minutes because we can get ready for the next speaker. So thank you for coming, and hope to see you again.
Okay, thank you.